When one thinks of pickups from the Chrysler Corporation, you often think about brands like Dodge and Ram. And for those who live in Canada, maybe Fargo. But one of the things that often doesn't come to mind when pickups are being discussed is the Plymouth division. But in fact, Plymouth did offer a pickup truck, and it was only in the market for 1 year, 1983, and that is what you see here, the Plymouth Scamp. Now, I know some of you are saying the Scamp, well, wasn't that kind of a sportier Valiant? Yes, it was in the 1970s, but the name was resurrected for the, let's call it less than beautiful vehicle that you see here that's depicted. Now, despite the homely looks, which we'll get to in a second, I think the Plymouth Scamp and its sister, the Dodge Rampage, it's hard to believe it was called the Dodge Rampage, especially once we talk about the engines under hood. In any case, the Dodge Rampage was marketed for 3 model years, 1982, 1983, and 1984. And these were 2 sister pickups that I think actually were kind of based on something that to some degree made sense. And that was that these are actually variants of the Chrysler L-Body or the Omni Horizon front-wheel drive vehicles, front-wheel drive, I should say, and unibody vehicles. The Omni and Horizon would be the first Chrysler front-wheel drive products produced in the United States, and they would also really lead the pack in the U.S. in terms of transversely mounted engines and transmissions and compact packages for economy vehicles, particularly given they came out in the late 1970s. It took GM as an example all the way until 1980 to really come out with its offering, at least in terms of the transversely mounted engine and transmission front-wheel drive vehicles. That was, of course, the X-Cars, the Citation, the Phoenix, the Omega, and the Skylark. But here you have, actually pretty novel for the time, a front-wheel drive and unibody pickup that was based on that kind of quirky, funky-looking Omni and Horizon, which I can't believe this. I had to look it up. The Omni and Horizon were actually produced all the way through the 1990 model year. Can you imagine seeing one of these in a dealership in 1990 when things like the Ford Taurus are in like other competitive showrooms? Boy, this car just looks so dated. But it lasted a long time, and I think they sold about 2.5 million Omni and Horizons over the car's lifetime. So it was a great seller. And then it started, let's say, spawning different variants, one of which is what you see here. Now, unfortunately, while great kind of on paper, the Plymouth Scamp and Dodge Rampage, well, let's just say, had a few challenges overall. Now, the first thing that you notice about the Scamp is it has that face that only a mother could love, this kind of anteater, underbite. I don't know how else you would describe that fascia. And it's a big fascia, too. Notice that the sheet metal terminates a lot further back from where the bumper is. So this was the era of bumper impact standards, and I'm sure that helped with it. But this has a face kind of like the Mercury LN7 of the early 1980s, which is not to say that it's a great face. I'm not usually a fan of cars with a severe underbite, and this one certainly needs to go to the orthodontist's office, especially with that ice cube tray style grille up front. Well, hey, at least you got a Chrysler emblem atop the hood. Interestingly, they went with the so-called barbell theme on the vehicle here, where the outer ends are fatter than the midsection of the car. I guess that was probably trying to make it look more powerful in keeping with its pickup truck, let's say, desires and aspirations. Although you really couldn't tow much with these. They were true kind of half-ton pickups. They could carry over 1,000 pounds of payload in the bed, but you weren't towing a lot with a unibody pickup unless you just wanted to shred your body. And speaking of body, these are kind of a bit funny looking in this particular side view. Looks like it needs a significantly longer wheelbase. The front overhang is enormous, and that really is because of the front-wheel drive proportions. You don't have the dash-to-axle that you would have on some of the rear-wheel drive pickups. And then the rear wheel, I guess it looks about okay. It could be a little bit further rearward. But the front wheel, I think, to my eye, certainly needs to be pushed further forward. It just looks a little funky. I do like the B-pillar and how it transitions into the top of the pickup truck bed with that, nice fillet, I would say, there, with a pretty big radius to it. Now, I will say that this car is a pretty plain Jane styled vehicle. You have that one body side crease that runs the entire length of the vehicle. But aside from that, you really don't have too much. You just have this graphics package with the stripe on this particular Scamp. And otherwise, the surfacing is not very complicated. The most complicated portion is the front end, which you previously saw. Now let's take a look at kind of a rear three-quarter view of a different Scamp. This one doesn't have that same graphics package, but it does have the blacked out lower section to give the car a bit of a slimming look. Also notice how high the body sits in the back relative to the wheels. I suppose this was done so that the body could compress on the springs if it were carrying payload capacity. You can see the bumper is also pretty big, kind of a tack-on piece. And I do think it's interesting how they integrated the drip rail here on the vehicle just above the glass, and then they continued it further rearward as opposed to terminating it when the glass stopped. So it's got a little bit of an eyebrow there on the B-pillar. One thing I also find a bit humorous is, well, this clearly was not a heavy-duty pickup, and one of the ways that you could tell that is the lug nuts. There are only 4 lug nuts per wheel here, so this was not going to be carrying any intense payload anytime soon. Now, out back in your Scamp, you got these vertical tail lamps that flanked the tailgate and some kind of old-school Plymouth block lettering that interestingly contrasted with the, I'll call it, playful, casual Scamp lettering there on the tailgate itself. So those badges really seem incongruent to me, the Plymouth font and the Scamp font. But hey, this was a lower-end car, and they probably were trying to just have a little bit of fun with it. And as we turn to the inside of the Scamp, well, it wasn't necessarily a horrible place to be, but it certainly wasn't a place of luxury as you would expect in a cheap pickup. But you notice that kind of typical for the time Chrysler Omni Horizon steering wheel, the 4-spoker there, with no badging in the middle. So that way you didn't feel bad, or Chrysler could save some money because they didn't have to change the badge between Plymouth and Dodge. It was just a generic 4-spoke wheel. Chrysler did that during this time frame. Sometimes their steering wheels didn't have badges. I've seen 2-spoke Chrysler wheels that also didn't have badges. And then their wheel covers sometimes were not badged, so they could use them across the lineup where they would say Chrysler Corporation on them, or something that would apply to many different vehicles. Now, you did get bucket seats in this particular Scamp, as you can see, and they were decently comfortable, but these cars, I would say, or these pickups, are relatively noisy on the inside, as you would suspect. They have almost no sound deadening. And back in this time frame, when a customer bought a cheap low-end car or a pickup truck like this, they really weren't expecting all that much refinement. That was a pleasant delight in the event that the vehicle was refined. They were really just looking for something that was useful and could haul some light loads from A to B and do so fuel efficiently, or I should say with fuel efficiency. So that was really the name of the game here, not NVH or noise, vibration, and harshness refinement in a super cheap pickup of this time frame. I would say the base price of these Scamps, if you adjusted them for inflation today, would be somewhere around like $15,000. In other words, you can hardly get anything. You can't get a new car for that price today. It's hard to find a new car for even anything under $25,000. But this would have been a very, very basic level vehicle for the time frame, and a good entry-level car or starter car as well. Now, one interesting interior feature of these Scamps is if you take a look just ahead of the door pull there, there's a little knob, and that is a twist knob for the door lock. There is no lock plunger on these door panels. You twist this little knob. It's almost like a glove box door latch, and that's how you lock or unlock the door. I just thought it was unconventional and worth pointing out. Now, under hood in these Plymouth Scamps and Dodge Rampages, you had Chrysler's 2.2-liter overhead cam 4-cylinder engine that made just a little under 100 horsepower, kind of in the 90 to 100 horsepower range, depended a little bit on the variant. So not all that great, but it was a decent engine. They tended to have head gasket issues, particularly on the turbocharged variants, but the naturally aspirated ones were okay. I wouldn't call them great, wouldn't call them horrible. I couldn't really find a great ad for the Plymouth Scamp, but I did find this great one for the Dodge Rampage. And you notice the tagline or the copy just underneath the headline, 0 to 50 miles per hour in 6.4 seconds. Wow. Probably means that it's a 9 second or so 0 to 60 car. So it's not all that fast, but really not all that bad, all things considered. And why did they advertise 0 to 50 miles per hour? Well, number one, don't forget that during this time frame that the national speed limit was 55 miles per hour. So what sense does a 0 to 60 mile per hour test make? And then secondly, I don't think the car makers complained and liked the 0 to 50 mile per hour, let's say, statistics, because it made the cars seem faster. 0 to 50 in 6.4 seconds. Gosh, that sounds blisteringly fast. And of course, it really was not. So this was a type of advertising that you saw on many different vehicles during this era, not just the Plymouths. Now also take a look at the EPA ratings. They're 47 highway, 28 city. This was really one of the most fuel-efficient pickups that were offered on the marketplace. Of course, there were other competitive vehicles from VW and Subaru, the Subaru Brat. I love that name. There were others as well, but those were some principal competitors. Regardless, you had a potentially very fuel-efficient pickup, lightweight, that could carry something and could get the job done and do so without costing much to operate. Now, unfortunately, it's clear that the Plymouth Scamp wasn't all that successful. Otherwise, why would it only last one model year? And I'm not quite sure why Plymouth wanted to step into this space. Perhaps dealers felt that they needed something to compete with the Dodge Rampage offering, or they were just jealous. And hence, Plymouth brought it to market for that 1 year only and really didn't change hardly anything versus the Dodge Rampage. Just the front end, like the fascia a little bit, a few other minor little things. So it didn't cost much to bring to market, but it was a 1 year experiment that failed, and the Dodge Rampage really wasn't all that successful either. It only lasted 3 model years, and that was it for the end of the line on that particular vehicle too. And I suppose that it just is what it is. By the time these vehicles came out, fuel prices were starting to decline, and they would really hit a nadir in the mid and late 1980s. And so they just weren't necessarily appropriate for the time. I would say if customers wanted to buy a more car-like pickup truck, they really were going to something like an El Camino that had a full frame underneath it, that was rear-wheel drive. I think it was tough for American buyers to really accept this foreign car formula. Like I said, VW, Subaru had something similar here. But unibody and front-wheel drive was tough for pickup truck buyers to think that they could really do much with it. Despite the fact that others, like Jeep, did have a unibody pickup, the Comanche. Of course, that was rear-wheel drive, and it wasn't all that successful relative to the Cherokee, as an example, and the CJ7 or the Wrangler or the more off-road type vehicles, really because of the unibody underneath. So what do you think of the Plymouth Scamp, the 1 year only Plymouth Scamp? Had you heard of it before? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching.